Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Petroleum Economist's 2020 LNG-to-power Forum for Asia Pacific. We're now into our final session of the day, the overall topic being structuring successful LNG-to-power projects. We have two panels, and the first panel will address a crucial question of whether an integrated project is better than a non-integrated project, or the other way around. And there are a number of factors to take into account here. Now, those of you who attended the last LNG-to-power forum in Houston last year may remember that one of the contributors to that panel made the point that a full-scale FSRU is quite a lot of gas to digest. So going back to some of the things we heard in one of the panels earlier today, an integrated project may need some sort of creative structuring to be able to work, unless you've got a very large amount of power to supply with gas. Anyway, to explore this fascinating subject and crucial subject for developing real life projects, I'm going to hand over to moderator Andy Brogan, who is Global Oil and Gas Sector Leader at EY. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. And good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking through the day to get to this panel. The way this panel is going to work is I'll ask our two panelists to give a quick introduction, and then we're going to get straight into the discussion. And if I can remind everybody, you've probably been reminded several times already during the course of the day, do use the chat function on the website to ask any questions, and I'll try and keep an eye on it as we're going through, and if things are coming up, I'll try and fit them in. And if I'm not picking up your question, then by far the most probable reason is that I'm having not unusually technological issues. So I'll start by asking Craig and Edwin just to give a quick introduction on who they are and what's their background. So Craig, if you'd like to kick off.
Sure, thanks, Andy, and thanks again for having me today for this exciting penultimate panel. So my name's Craig Henderson. I'm with Advisian, which is a consulting arm of the Worley Group. And quite simply, over the last sort of 8 years, I've had one objective, and that's really to get some of these LNG-to-power projects up and running. I think listening to a lot of the discussion earlier today, you know, there's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of complexity, and what we're here today to try and achieve is to create some simplicity in all this complexity, and specifically on the topic of integrated versus non-integrated, what are the tips and tricks we can do? So looking forward to this panel and hoping to share some light on some of the ways we can create these projects.
Thanks, Craig. Edwin?
Hi, thank you, Andy, and it's great to be here, and thanks for inviting me on the panel. My name is Edwin Vanderbruggen. I lead a law firm in Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, of around 300 lawyers and consultants, 100 of which are in our Myanmar offices where I'm based. In that capacity, I've worked on about 10 gig of generation projects, and some of them are gas to power or LNG to power. From that segment, I am working on the Milang project, which is done by a Chinese consortium in the south of Myanmar. The V-Power LNG to power projects, which were tendered 2 years ago, some of which are now in generation in Chopio, Taketa, and Tanlin. And on the development of Total and Siemens's Kambach project, which is still under discussion. So, you know, I look forward to sharing some of the, practical the do's and don'ts from that experience. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Edwin. Well, let's get straight into it then. The first question I wanted to explore was, it really is around structuring, and both from the engineering contractual side, but also from the legal financial side. What are the main structuring issues that you've seen, and are they fundamentally different to the issues that you would see just on a standard sort of regas plant project, or are they unique to this? And are they getting easier at the moment, or are they getting harder, and why? So I'll start by throwing that over to you, Craig, and then on to Edwin.
Sure, thanks, Andy. A nice easy one to start. Let's just solve it all off the first question. Look, some of the key issues here is firstly in what are the benefits of going in an integrated fashion, and arguably one of the biggest ones is we start to align the commercial incentives of, say, the regas co and the power co. Ultimately, we're trying to fall under a kilowatt hour tariff ceiling that's created by the energy market in whatever developing a country we're going into. So that automatically gets rid of some of the tension of myself as a power developer. I want to reduce my cost to increase my profit, and 80% arguably of my biggest cost is going to be my fuel cost. But as the regas company, I want to maximize that profit, so I want to increase the revenue as much as possible. So pulling the two together really does help with the commercial challenge, and that's what we're really starting to see become more and more important with the advent of renewables and other parts of generation onto the grid. So that's one of the great reasons and why a lot of people are looking to incentivize to go integrated. I think already a lot we've heard today is let's put the risk with the best person who's best company who's placed to manage that risk. We've talked a lot about project on projects. It does get us into the situation of piggy in the middle risks when we've got offtakes and supply, with different dynamics and different storage volumes. It does get a bit tricky. The one thing I must note we're coming more and more to terms with is really around gas availability. So in markets where gas to power has been prevalent, particularly with domestic gas, we talk Thailand and Myanmar to a degree and other places, we got used to having a very reliable system where essentially we switched on a valve at the boundary of our power plant and we had available gas. I think over the last sort of 10 years, we're starting to come to terms with the availability and the reliability impacts of LNG systems themselves, not just the logistics chain coming in, but also with the advent of the floating storage solutions, the realities around our natural environment and particularly our wave heights and wave periods and what that means for our projects. So I think a lot of the local authorities are starting to come to terms with what those availability impacts may mean. And really, because of that, starting to get a bit more realistic around how should we look to structure these projects and what sort of overall system reliability we should be comfortable with. So those are probably a good starting point as some of the main issues. And I think we're slowly becoming more informed as an industry around what the approach should be. The key point here is it's not like we've just got an open whiteboard to restructure a project in a perfect LNG to power economy in a new country. Things have been done before. Coal has been around. Domestic gas has been around. We've got to be mindful that we can't just change this. Some of the most successful LNG to power projects are essentially based off what was a coal-fired PPA. So we've got to understand that complexity and how we build that into it. So that's probably some nice starting points there.
Okay. Edwin, from I guess starting from a legal perspective, but perhaps also from a finance perspective, just at the moment, what do you see are the main issues, and perhaps also your practice is working across the region. So are there things that are unique to particular countries, or is it the same issues everywhere?
I think I agree with what Craig said. We've seen quite a development, and for example, if I take Myanmar as an example, in the 2015-2019 period, it was really just a question mark as to what does the off-taker want, the government, the utility. What kind of terms are they prepared to accept? What kind of structure are they prepared to accept? It's difficult to just by yourself in a boardroom, maybe with the suppliers and with the EPC guys, come up with a proposal, come up with a structure, if you don't know what the government is prepared to sign on to. And that is just on a commercial basis. But very often in many of these countries, there are also legal and regulatory uncertainties as to how you structure how you structure an LNG project, whether it is even allowed to own both gas facilities and combined cycle facilities in the same structure. There may be differences in foreign ownership restrictions. There may be requirements of government equity. There may be requirements of local partnerships, and they may be different in when it comes to gas processing or just gas storage and pipelines, and finally then the generation. So I think that in Myanmar, for example, in the 2015-2019 period, there was a lot of discussions with potential sponsors who wanted to do something on LNG with the government. But the government had never done any LNG. And so you've seen, I think those on in the audience who have followed Myanmar a bit will have seen some of these, a little bit weird moves. Yeah? They did it to MOGE, the oil and gas enterprise, the state-owned oil and gas enterprise of Myanmar, did a tender for an LNG-to-power project, which was then subsequently just not talked about anymore. That was, if I'm not mistaken, in 2017 or something, 2016, 2017. Yeah. To then and then we heard, and then suddenly, almost overnight, it seemed, you had those 4 NTPs coming out, including the NTP, which is like a preliminary approval by the ministry for the LNG-to-power project of Total and Siemens, but also of 3 other gas and LNG-to-power projects, including Milongjak, which is now really going into development very soon. Not knowing exactly what the government is willing to accept in terms of who to contract with, that has quite an impact on not knowing what the structure should be. I remember on one deal, we took about 6 months of just considering devising and redevising the structure, whether or not we put the gas infrastructure in the same entities under an offshore, of course, but whether it would be in the same entities as the combined cycle or not. And when the government can never tell you, well, this is what we want, then it's difficult to finalize that. But I think now that is a lot clearer in 2020, because now at least the government in Myanmar says, look, we don't want to deal with your gas entity. We have nothing to do with that. I'm buying electricity, that's it. So I just want to have a contract. I'm going to sign a PPA. And I don't want anything to do with your shipping problems and with your, you may have a separate entity doing the processing or organizing, owning the facilities for the FSRU or owning the facilities for the storage. That's fine, but I'm not going to sign anything with them. And that, of course, is also not possible, because we do need to talk in the PPA about the take or pay of the LNG itself. In case there are deviations from the schedule, yeah, and that was actually in the actual PPA negotiations, that was difficult, particularly to do that for the first time on Kambuk. Now I think with the V-Power projects, we have signed PPAs. Milongjak practically also a signed PPA. So these things, EPG has learned a lot from negotiating Kambuk, even though that deal is still under negotiation, and has learned how to approach a price schedule that also has a component of take or pay just for the gas supplies.
Okay, so just building on that, I mean, are there things that you talked about it a bit in the context of Myanmar? What are the top couple of things that governments can do to make these things happen more quickly, or perhaps on the other side, from what are the things that you really don't want to see governments doing if these projects are going to go ahead? And I'll stick with you, Edwin, for that first, and then get Craig your view on that.
Yeah, one of the thanks for that. One of the more controversial questions that came up is the unwillingness of the Myanmar government to issue sovereign guarantees in connection with these projects. So they've done. We have pushed them a lot. I think certain international organizations have pushed them a lot. IFC has tried to explain many times. On the other hand, you have IMF telling them, "Oh no, you probably shouldn't do that. You should be very careful with this." Yeah. At the end of the day, what they did is they ran these tenders without any guarantees, and they thought, well, let's see if we can find a sponsor who is willing to take this deal from us without a sovereign guarantee. And yeah, in the projects that were run by V-Power, which are 5-year contracts, yeah, these are power rental based things. There was no such sovereign guarantee, and the project also got done. Yeah, and I think I think it's a bit it's probably unnecessary for the government to try to rely on only that segment of the investors who are willing to do this without sovereign guarantees.
Right.
And it's I don't know if that has such a positive impact on the pricing. I cannot imagine that it has a positive impact on the pricing. But the whole issue of sovereign guarantees, if the government would want to do something to help infrastructure development in Myanmar, and I've written this before in op-eds, then coming out with a transparent, predictable, reasonable policy for sovereign guarantees would probably be a silver bullet to make it happen. That being said, I keep being disproven by the actual reality, because they've just done 1,000 megawatt tender for solar projects. Well, they're smaller projects, they're 30, 40 megawatt nuggets, but there's not, you couldn't find a sovereign guarantee there if your life depended on it. And still, it's fully bid.
Yeah, still people coming. Okay.
Yeah,
Craig,
still people coming. Yeah.
Your view on what government should or should not be doing?
Yeah, maybe building on from that, and perhaps putting aside the creditworthiness of some of these developing economies, because I think that is a material issue that we've already touched on. The broad comment of regulatory certainty. Getting into some of the specifics, I think earlier today we had that concept of we don't need a fully defined future plan over various time horizons. What we need is clarity of vision, understanding what the role of renewables, what the role of monetizing existing resources, be it, domestic gas reserves, be it coal, be it whatever. We just need an understanding in, development plans around how that could work, and then let the market take its own, let the market forces come to bear. The other key thing that really does stop a lot of these projects, and it's simply the environmental and social approvals angles.
Right.
There's a lot of uncertainty around what is the LNG approvals required to be. And the second one, which is a little bit of a project killer where we do need further government support, is actually on the power evacuation infrastructure, the transmission and distribution systems, and the ESIA work that goes behind those, and who's actually willing to finance and, create more stable grids. And that has been some particular challenges, in project work in Myanmar, Philippines, Cambodia, even, where we're looking to create gas economy. So I think a lot more visionary and clarity of vision around those key regulatory aspects will really help a lot of these projects get up and running.
Okay, thank you for that. So you touched on briefly there financing, and I wanted to explore that a bit, not so much from a financing angle, but from a project angle in terms of what makes financing easier or harder. And one of the things I would be interested to get your view on in particular is on the vexed subject of overriding EPC versus separate contracting. Then do you see one necessarily working better than the other, either from an operational perspective or getting financing perspective? or do you just think it is very much project by project? And I suspect we may have a couple of EPCs listening to this, so so we'll see if our listeners agree.
Yeah, very, very good question. I think, I mean, straight off the bat, in my view, what the financiers and the lenders are looking for is a completely wrapped, de-risked, integrated EPC. That is a bit of a nirvana situation. There's naturally developed over time skill sets in, be it offshore, be it onshore infrastructure, be it power infrastructure, supporting infrastructure, whatever it may be. There's specialist EPC firms out there that really have doubled down in that sector. That said, there's a lot more novel engineering approaches coming to market, which to me is really exciting. You know, to get these projects to work, we're trying to strip out as much cost as possible. And one lever to pull is the contracting approach. The other is the physical assets. That's exciting, but we're seeing it's challenged from a financing perspective. You know, we want to see how far up the technology readiness level curves those novel systems are. And most importantly, how they will perform in some of the environments they're getting put into. I think we've alluded to it a few times. Unfortunately, in a lot of these developing economies, the sea states and the location of the load centers aren't exactly the nicest and most inviting areas to put in an LNG-to-power project. So we're looking at some of, you know, jettyless solutions, you know, transfer systems that don't require, you know, expensive mooring structures, and concepts where we don't need a breakwater. And, you know, breakwaters quite simply often kill projects in this part of the world just because of the commercials we need to tie into. So, I mean, the short answer here is that it's a trade-off between, we want to still follow the design one, build many approach, but we need to almost fit the right bits of Lego together. And unfortunately, that sort of fitting the right bits of Lego together doesn't necessarily invite the complete wrapped EPC approach for the full integrated LNG-to-power project. What we're seeing a lot, and even in integrated structures, is two separate EPCs, or having an interim EPC allowing an FSRU co to do obviously their own, you know, charter and arrangement, have a smaller sort of intermediate co who's doing, you know, transfer systems to a power plant and leaving the power plant in a full wrap. And that said, above that, we've also got a lot of the interesting dynamics of local content and what we like to call the fence contractor. How do we engage as much local contract into those EPC arrangements as possible? So there's that added dynamic and that, you know, continued dynamic of building local content in some of these economies.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Edwin, I'd be interested in your view, just from a perspective of putting these deals together, about what makes it easier or harder in terms of, you know, overriding EPC versus split. But also on the last point that was just raised, what do you think good looks like in terms of engaging local content and actually doing it whilst retaining the economics of the project? And other examples of that you can point to and say, yeah, that's where we think they got it about right.
Yeah, thanks. And you know, it's weird. Every project I do in, I don't know if this is just for Myanmar or if it's in other countries as well. We start out talking about an integrated project, and we end up doing separate structures, yeah, separate entities with the gas in under one legal structure and the combined cycle under another legal structure. Separate entities from each other, and whether that has something to do with how the way consortiums work in Asia, maybe Craig is better placed to answer that. But I always end up with this, and my experience has been that just having we often need some kind of more or less artificial split in the EPCs anyway. Because to avoid unnecessary adverse tax consequences in these jurisdictions. I'm talking about Myanmar and Cambodia particularly. And that hasn't really been a problem so far for lenders in my experience. What has been a problem for lenders is some legacy problems or you know, institutional problems that come with that. For example, in one case, the government had already finished some of the assets, building some of the assets themselves, probably poorly, and then wanted this integrated into into the facilities, and that became very, very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Because not every EPC provider is happy to just take on a couple of acres of concrete and just integrate that in their project and declare it as if they have built it themselves. Who knows how that was built exactly? So those kind of legacy issues are a problem for lenders. I've also often had problems with government equity and local partner equity, that lenders find it difficult to engage with. Some projects have a very big chunk of local equity, and it is not always easy to put up that part of equity to predict when that part of equity can be closed. And in one of our big projects, the Mingyan gas-to-power project, which included Semcorp and a local partner, issues surrounding the contributions by both the partners and how this was all organized, that became a matter for international arbitration and local litigation. And even though the project did go into development, but there was three years late or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
nobody wants to have issues like that. I think a third issue that is a particular problem for classic project financing for all lenders actually in Myanmar is that the government tend to not do anything for 4 years and then suddenly wake up and say, oh my God, we need power in 6 months. So you can put in a bid, but you have to put $5 million of guarantee on the line that you will finish on time within 6 months, knowing that schedule, that you're going to lose the $5 million for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I have sponsors who just say, no, I'm just writing that off as part of my investment because I know it cannot be done. EPG knows it cannot be done. Just converting the land takes a year. So how are you going to build? Right? So, and then, you mentioned environmental before. We just have a bunch of laws that just are not, if you follow them by the book, nothing will be built. It is impossible, right? So you need shortcuts and special situations for which that may or may not be entirely legal, who knows. You get a piece of paper from someone saying, oh, you don't need that permit, but is that someone actually authorized to issue that
Mm-hmm.
paper? Who knows? So these are things that are not black and white, with environmental permits, we have a law in Myanmar that says that you can't even lift a brick, you can't put a spade in the soil until you have a full-blown environmental permit, and nobody can get one. We have tens of thousands of projects in the country. We have maybe 24 of environmental certificates. So then you have to say, well, can I start before I have this permit? Well, you can do preliminary works. What is preliminary works? Nobody knows. So are your lenders happy proceeding, even though the best their lawyers can say is that, well, we cannot exclude that someone comes along and says that you're breaking environmental law?
I have to say though, having spent 20 odd years working in emerging markets in particular, and none of those issues necessarily unique to integrated gas-to-power projects. I think I've seen that kind of ambiguity have to be managed through in a lot of places around the world. One thing you mentioned there, which brings me on to another area which I thought would be interesting to get your views on and to get Craig's views on, is certainly for the large LNG sort of liquefaction gasification projects, we went over the last couple of years to a position where you needed to have a dominant, financially robust lead operator or sponsor involved, really, to get things moving. And I wanted to get your views on the whole sort of, I'll shortcut them as saying sort of super major type involvement versus merchant project in this space. And what if you look at the projects that are currently moving or not moving, does it look like merchant projects can sort of go ahead and the financing is there for them, or do you really need one of these deep-pocketed sponsors to really get over the initial hump and get things moving? So perhaps I'll start that one with Craig and then come back to Edwin.
Yeah, sure. Really good question, Andy. I think first up, we've seen a huge change over the last, I'd be so bold to say 10 years, around not having the traditional, IOC anchoring some of these regas terminal projects, or the traditional developers who've had regas projects in their home in North Asia now looking to develop elsewhere. There are a lot of people who are coming in and trying to exploit some of the, the current market dynamics. And really what we are in is we're in an oversupplied world, and we're in a world where we want to anchor that into power. And I think we don't need to get into the detail why that is the case. So we're seeing a lot of consortia led from the power developers. We're seeing a lot of consortia led from those who have already taken volumes, being traders and others. And this is creating an interesting dynamic about a different way to view some of these projects. And, if you can broadly break it down into different developer types, and you could argue people may sit in each different type depending on which jurisdiction, you've got what we like to call the minimalists, the ones who are really coming in under a price hurdle and cost is key. These are the ones going for floaters, integrated solutions, where typically availability and reliability of the systems isn't that key. It's really just getting into the lowest commercial position as possible. Adjacent to them, you've got the fast movers, as we like to talk them. Again, the floaters. Let's exploit the oversupply, with the bump in the LNG market at the moment. It's cheap, it's available. Let's use that, but we need to get in 6 months, 12 months, whatever it may be. And then we move almost completely to the other side, where we've got what we call the perfectionists, and these are the IOC-esque people who are making sure everyone's aligned. We're taking a 20-year view on this. We're balancing it with the rest of our global portfolio, and we're making sure everyone's aligned, the local content and everything, which is great, but unfortunately they're not the ones who are getting the projects up and running quickly, and they're really competitive against the others at the moment. And then you've got the others, again, we call them the peacemaker. This is the full environmental approval personnel. This is typically led by the power side. It's making sure social license to operate in these jurisdictions is there in place. And again, the 20-year view, and commercials will ultimately work out for them. But in the short term, they're often willing to take a bit of a loss. And we're seeing a lot of the lending community shifting away from these people and trying to focus on, the minimalists or the fast movers to actually get these projects up and running.
Okay, that's interesting. And you see the balance at the moment is the minimalists and the fast movers are really getting things done.
Yes, I'd be so bold to say that. And also, interestingly enough, we've seen the IOCs, or the IECs, sorry, integrated energy companies now, as we like to call them. They're also adapting to this new way of working. So gone are the traditional, we are, insert name of large IOC. It's sort of, well, we need to compete against the others, and the beast we've created through trying to make this LNG market more liquid. So it's really exciting times.
Okay, so Edwin, is that consistent with what you're seeing in terms of who's making their projects go faster?
Yes, it's true. The fast movers, the go big or go home, they run the table for the moment, and we see more and more. We see an approach where a tender is done in Cambodia or in Myanmar, and you have a regional player with a higher risk profile moving in very fast. They may already have local relationships, they may already own land or something like that. And once they have preliminary approvals or political approvals, then they turn around and they bring in their consortium members, who are then able to look at this in their own due time, and everything has already been negotiated, and so they're able to then strengthen that consortium and have their own deal at their own terms, if you like. I think particularly when it comes to Myanmar, there's a lot of questions that I often get, and even in the press. Well, it's actually only the Chinese players who can make any money in Myanmar. They're the only ones who are getting deals. How true is that? Well, I don't think that is by design. That is not by political choice. I know that is not by political choice. If all else being equal, if you ask the cabinet, you will find that they will prefer a regionally or internationally balanced group of sponsors. Yeah, and I can easily prove that that's true, because when there are plenty of unsolicited projects, that untendered projects that directly go to Western companies. Yeah, you had Total and Siemens, that was never tendered. Yeah, you have Shweli 3 with EDF and Marubeni coming in there later. That was never tendered. Yeah, you have SN Power on a big hydropower. That was also never tendered. Yeah, that's a Norwegian company, as many of you will know. So I don't think it's fair to say, oh, there's a political favoritism going on there. I think what it is that, well, Chinese, during the time that Western companies were not allowed to do any business at all, which was the better part of, the 19s, nearly the whole 90s. Chinese companies were doing business there, building up relationships, right? Not always, it wasn't always very successful business, but there's been some things that went wrong, but they did get a lot of stuff done as well. Yeah. And the rest of it, as I can see, in some of the tenders that recently went on, it's all a matter of risk tolerance. Yeah, do you have access to cheap money? Do you have an appetite for some risk? Are you prepared to sign on the dotted line and get everything operational in 6 months? When
you can't.
Even though there's plenty of people telling you, well, it might not happen, but are you willing to move ahead with that anyway? Then for better or for worse, that is the kind of deals that the government is now looking for. So that's where that turns out. But I've also organized and evaluated tenders for the government, for the Ministry of Energy. And I can tell you from the inside, there is no political favoritism for Chinese companies. There's just a number of factors that play into their benefit.
Okay. Well, I see we are approaching our time now. So I was going to ask you both the same question, which is probably the most difficult question of all, which is, if you're going to try and structure an integrated gas to power project, then what are the 2 or 3 things that you absolutely must get right? I'll start with you, Craig, and then I'll finish with Edwin.
Perfect. Great question. So the 2 key things is firstly understanding your demand dynamics, and more importantly your supply-led demand dynamics in a lot of these cases. It's understanding what is our likely offtake to be, and what is our upside and what is our downside of that offtake. A Nirvana situation is, yes, we anchor with power, but then we move to using and creating a gas economy around us in a special industrial zone or whatever it may be, and then working backwards from that demand phasing into what the physical infrastructure can look like. It's a great thing, and the engineer in me loves it, because you've got a beautiful demand increase, but then you've got really big lumpy chunks of supply infrastructure that needs to be put together, and figuring out if that then lends itself to an integrated structure or a separated structure. That's a key point. And building onto that is, it's lovely when it's all theoretical. The other thing a lot of us often forget, and we get caught up in the complexities of risk allocation and financing and commercials, is what is the physical environment telling us? And that physical environment, you know, dredging systems, water depths, wave heights, monsoon predictions, all those bits of knowledge come together that actually can often very quickly point to the fact of, look, this really lends itself to an LNG aggregator opportunity. And that can have an anchor customer, yes, but the availability concerns and having a third-party access to a terminal or whatever it may be is going to make an integrated structure very tricky. So going back to basics, figuring out what the environment's really telling us for the demand location, and then backstepping to, should this be integrated or separated?
Okay, thanks, Craig. Edwin, if you could do it in a minute, then I think our organisers would be grateful.
I'll do it very quick. I think based on my experience, I would say make sure that you have partners that have the same philosophy, the same experience in the local country, the same relationships in the local country. If one experienced partner has to drag another unexperienced partner into this, screaming and kicking, in the end, it's not going to work. And the second point that I would like to say is be clear from the outset with EPG what you need. And if they don't want to give it to you, walk away right there and not 9 months later. Okay,
thank you. Thanks, Edwin. Gentlemen, thank you very much for that. I think it's very interesting. We never really got on to LNG aggregation either, which was one of the things I was hoping we'd get around to covering. So thank you for that. Thank you for your input. Thank you for the questions that have been submitted that we didn't get around to. And I'll hand back to our organisers.
Thanks, Andy.